Hello and welcome to the Bill Parker National Security Show. I'm your host, Dr. Bill Parker, and we have a great show for you here today. Joining us is retired four-star General T. Michael Moseley, the 18th Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. In 2008, General Moseley completed a distinguished 40-plus year military career in his position as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, serving as the senior uniformed Air Force officer responsible for the organization, training, and equipage of over 700,000 active duty Air National Guard, Air Force Reserve, and civilian personnel serving worldwide. In this role, General Moseley also served as the nation's senior airman and provided primary military advice and counsel to the President and the National Security Council on operational planning and programming issues relative to global air, space, and cyberspace operations. General Moseley was a career fighter pilot with over 3,000 airs flying the latest combat aircraft. The General, as we all call him, has been knighted by Her Majesty the Queen of England, and the President of the French Republic also honored him, serving a name as Commander in the National Order of the Legion of Honor. He was personally awarded 2 Defense Distinguished Service Medals by the Secretary of Defense for his combat innovation and leadership in the Middle East. And upon retirement, he was awarded a 3rd Air Force Distinguished Medal, as well as Distinguished Service Medals from the Department of Army, Department of the Navy, and from the Coast Guard / Department of Homeland Security. He serves on a variety of supervisory boards and civic organizations while serving as president and CEO of Moseley and Associates LLC, consulting on global security matters as well as operationalizing new technology. He remains active in lecturing on leadership and the international security environment, and he is currently the chairman of Hillwood Aviation, a Perot company, and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We have placed his biography, his whole biography, on the website, so you can see the incredible number of awards and accolades that the General's received. General, it's really great having you on the show today. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, Bill, thank you. As an old friend, it's good to be able to spend some time with you, even though we're separated from South Carolina to New York. It's also a real treat to be able to share some thoughts with you. First off, we wish you and Kitty a wonderful, wonderful Christmas and a new year all through this holiday season. And thanks for including me on this. And to all those folks that are listening, we wish them, Jenny and I wish them a happy holiday as well. So I'm looking forward to talking, looking forward to sharing some thoughts.
Thank you, General, and the same to you and your amazing family. So there's a lot going on out there in the world, but I thought with your permission, we'd start with Russia and Ukraine, and then maybe China and Taiwan, Afghanistan. I mean, there's so much going on, and you can speak to all of it. Would you mind if we start with Russia and Ukraine as a starting point?
No, I think right now the global challenges, we have a wealth of things to talk about, whether it's across Europe or whether it's across South Asia or the Western Pacific. So wherever you want to start, Bill, let's dive in.
Okay, so Russia and Ukraine, General, why is this in the national interest of the United States? Why do we care? It's halfway around the daggone world.
Well, Bill, I think we care for a couple of reasons, and I'm not so hard over on the Ukraine being a part of NATO, which I think is a part of this issue. But allow me to go back just a little bit. I think in 1989, when the Soviet Union came apart, there was a sense of those in leadership positions inside the Soviet Union that the world that they were comfortable with for decades had collapsed on them, and that perhaps they had a sense that the West was about to victimize them in kind of a sense of a victory in the Cold War. And I think what we're seeing is an evolution over time of classic Russian notions of defense of their homeland relative to the border areas that have been crossed in invasion so many times. And I think Mr. Putin is one of those classic Russian leaders that is consumed by the notion of defense of Mother Russia. So I think once the Soviet Union fell apart, then Belarus, the Ukraine, the stands all the way across the southern border areas of Russia became very real and very emotional to the Russian leadership. And so I think we can see from what Putin and the Russians did in the Crimea. And remember, the Crimea was claimed by Russia all the way back to Catherine I. Their Black Sea Fleet, their military headquarters, everything is there in Sevastopol and the Crimea. So if you think at it, if you're looking at this from Moscow's perspective, you're looking at this as buffers to the approaches to Mother Russia from the West. And so when Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and the previous Warsaw Pact countries all jumped at the opportunity to be part of NATO, I think that causes concerns in Moscow. And I think this Ukraine issue is that. And I think Kiev and the Ukraine means so much to the history of Russia that the Russian nationalists see this as a Russian issue, not a NATO issue or an EU issue. And so if we look at it from the other side, will he invade? I don't know. I'd hate to make a prediction, but my gut would say no, because I think he knows he's making a point about NATO and about the Ukraine and NATO. But I believe he also realizes that the Europeans and the Americans and perhaps the rest of the world, the sanctions would be severe. And I think that's not the only motivation. But I think his point is we're defending Russia. And the NATO inclusion of the previous Warsaw Pact, imagine how threatening that was to the strategic planners in Moscow. And perhaps if we could go back in time, perhaps there was a better way to embrace Moscow in those early days, to perhaps in partnership of some things: counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, global trafficking, space, free use of space. Maybe there were things that could have been done, but we're beyond that now. So I think what we're seeing is an issue of a deterrent to the West about inclusion of the Ukraine into NATO. And so if NATO becomes, or if the Russians become very aggressive in the Ukraine, it's going to affect the United States because it will affect Europe. It will affect the energy sources of Europe. It will affect activities within Europe. It will focus activities across NATO and across the EU. And so my advice would be, let's tamp down the rhetoric and let's tamp down the throwing of rocks at each other across the border. And let's look for ways to ensure that the people of Ukraine are not in any way threatened by invasion or by any kind of coercive activities. But let's also look at ways that we can restart things like the strategic arms limitation talks. We can restart activities at a very high level with Moscow, so that we're working toward the same end of not having to fight each other. And I think Mr. Putin appreciates that sort of thing, and I think he respects that sort of thing. But I think the Cliff Notes version of this is, it's all about Ukraine and NATO, and it's all about the classic sense of threats to Mother Russia. And I think if we understand that, then we can work this. We Americans can work this so the consequences of something in the Ukraine are not severe for both our European partners and friends, or the Russians, or the American economy, or the American access to trade, et cetera, across Europe. So that's kind of a Cliff Notes version there, Bill. But that's kind of how I see Russia and the Ukraine right now.
General, do you see a situation similar to we saw prior to World War II, or as World War II was breaking out, where Ukraine is first, and then there's a follow-on of Georgia and the stands and others? Or do you see this as strictly a scenario between Russia and Ukraine?
That's a great question. I think that right now this is Russia and the Ukraine because of the emotionalism of Kiev and what Kiev means to Russian history, and the 1954, I believe, deals that were made relative to the Soviet Union and the Ukraine, which included the Crimea. I think the Ukraine to Russia is more than just a bordering entity. I think it is part of their cultural identity. And so I believe what Mr. Putin is doing is making the case that he intends to defend Russia, because historically the approaches to Russia go through these areas and the borders, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. They're very sensitive to the Russian military because they've been invaded across that area. Now, do we see invasions from NATO from Poland? I don't think so. But I think the sensitivities, the nationalistic sensitivities to defend their country is taking them to this point. And I think we should understand that. We should not in any way give away anything that would threaten the Ukrainian people. But I think we should be very, very careful in extending invitations to membership in NATO that the second and third order effects might be severe.
So President Biden recently implied and stated that we would do sanctions, but you would not see military forces from the United States going into Ukraine other than those that are in advisory roles. Similarly, you're not seeing a large number of NATO forces in Ukraine right now. Do you see then that we have basically told Russia that we are not going to do anything militarily if they decide to go in? Or is that a bad assumption on the part of Putin? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think by making statements about what you won't do, what you will not do, I think sometimes turns around and might bite you. I think in retrospect, I think the best way to say things like that are, we will take actions relative to the desires of the Ukrainian people, and we will ensure that the Ukrainian people are not in any way subjected to kinetic or even non-kinetic attack, because they have a right of self-defense and they have a right of self-determination as well. I think NATO needs to be prepared as far as a force posturing notion relative to forces in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary on the boundaries of all of this. But I would be very hesitant to make statements about what the United States or NATO will not do.
So, General, in the past, you have said, leave all the instruments of national power on the table. Don't take any of them off for your enemy. Make him take them off.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. Military, economic, diplomatic, coalition, partnering, but also at the same time look for things to engage the Russians at the highest levels. Strategic arms limitation talks. I mean, we have several new classes of weapons, hypersonic. Specifically, we have lots of activities in space and in cyber. Terrorism is still an issue for both Russia and the West. Human trafficking, narcotics. There's so many things that we could focus together on that would offer opportunities for high-level mill-to-mill or high-level diplomatic and even economic exchange that you could engage across the board without being threatening.
So I've made the point in the past, and I'd like to know whether you agree, disagree. Either way is okay with me. What your thoughts are on this, and that is that I think that we have many things that are in the same focus area that the Russians have. For instance, we're both predominantly Christian countries still. Neither one of us had a good time in Afghanistan. We both have an opioid problem. We both have problems with China in different ways, them incursion of real estate and us in other situations. We both are oil-rich countries in many ways. So we have a lot in common and actually very little not in common. And yet, for some reason, we can't seem to get past that.
I agree. We're also big countries. We also cross multiple time zones, lots of resources, lots of opportunity. We're also spacefaring nations. We live in space. We operate in space. We're also operating in the cyber domain. Of the 4 strategic commons of international airspace, international maritime, cyber, and space, we are in direct contact with the Russians across all of those strategic domains. There's many, many ways that we can work the areas that you talked about in some kind of collaborative sense with the Russians. And I think we should explore all of that. the Russians are rich in resources. They're rich in the ability to extract things, but some of their challenges are to be able to get it out and to transport the resources out. But at the end of the day, they're a nuclear power with thousands of warheads, just like we are. And we have to live with each other. We live with each other across those strategic commons. We rub up against each other at sea and in the air, in cyber and in space. I mean, the Russians just conducted an anti-satellite shot here recently, testing out one of their new systems. So, Bill, I'm with you. I think there's so many opportunities to deal with the Russians that offer opportunities for dialogue and continual dialogue. So we can talk to each other, and we can make the world a safer place by engaging each other. But I wouldn't take any of the tools of national strategic power off the table. I wouldn't tell people what I won't do.
General, there are people out there that are saying this is the time when Russia and China are going to operate simultaneously, and that Russia is going to roll into Ukraine at the same time that China invades Taiwan. And I'd like to get into China a little bit, but before we do that, what are your thoughts? Is this a potential for a simultaneous event, or is that pretty unlikely?
It could be, Bill. It could be. I would pray that it would not be. But I think we would have to ask ourselves, what would the motivations be for Beijing and Moscow to do that? We'll get into China a little bit in a minute. But Russia is a big, proud place with a big, proud national history. So is China, so is the United States, so are the nations in Europe, so is Japan. You would have to ask yourself, what motivations would that be? The United States came out of Afghanistan. We'll get to that in a little bit. Probably not looking as competent that we could have, and we're seeing on the domestic side, we're seeing some things that are a bit of a challenge as far as our economy, inflation, and jobs. We're still dealing with the COVID issue, as is China, and as is Russia, as is Europe. I'm just not sure what motivation I would see for Beijing and Moscow to take a run at this, and because of the desired end state. If you're going to do that, the desired end state would be global domination. It would be to try to take Europe and the Americans, the allies, the coalition partners, Japan, off the table. In the economies of the United States and Japan, when you add Japan and the United States economic throw rate, it's twice of China. So I'm not sure this is real. I think, though, the Chinese see opportunities, and we'll get to the Chinese in a minute. I think the Russians are making a statement about the defense of Russia. And I think Europe, with pipelines and with dependence on natural gas and petroleum out of Russia, I think Mr. Putin is making a point that he wants to be taken very serious, that there are historic and cultural ties with the Ukraine that have been there for centuries, with the city of Kiev and Russian history. And I think he's making a point about membership in NATO as a potential threat to, in their view, Mother Russia. But I just don't see the motivation of Beijing and Moscow teaming up right now for a simultaneous thrust, into the heart of Europe and into a democratic entity in the Western Pacific, knowing what would happen with the other Pacific partners, particularly Japan and South Korea. So it would have to be very quick. It would have to be very violent, and it would have to be very decisive. And I don't see that militarily as a desired or a doable course of action from Beijing and Moscow.
No, I agree with you. I think it's something worth considering and something to be prepared for. And what are you going to do in response to it? But I think it's probably an unlikely scenario that you see it. And maybe for some other reasons too. I'd like your thoughts on this. One of which is, Xi Jinping is coming up on an unprecedented third time in office, and so do you want to mess that up, which is right now pretty much a guarantee by all of a sudden your country being at war. And I don't think this is a walk in the park. If anybody thinks it's going to be a walk in the park for mainland China to roll into Taiwan, I think they're mistaken. Taiwan is very capable, and you would know that better than anyone. But those are my thoughts there. In addition to that, do you really want to mess with your economy right now when you have enough challenges already with your economy between COVID and the banking system and the issues they have with that, and now the major real estate company going belly up? I'm not sure that this is would be a smart move for them. And if nothing else, the Chinese are patient and will look at this at 1,000 years or 100 years and not at 5 years. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I think we talked about how I believe the Russians look at themselves as far as Russians and as far as the history of Russia. I believe the Chinese look at themselves and they see, as they've told you and I in many, many meetings, there is no history before China. They see themselves as an ancient, continuing culture. They see themselves, as they call themselves, the Middle Kingdom. And they see the things that have happened bad to China over the centuries, over the millennia, as being a fracturing of the social structure, a breakdown of their provinces or their territories, a breakdown of internally to them, invasions, Manchu, Han, etc. They see, I believe, they see everything bad that's happened to them as a result of lack of central control over their territories and their population. And I believe they see themselves in a historic sense as key leaders in East Asia and key leaders in the Western Pacific. In fact, if you go back a ways into the early 1800s to the mid 1800s, if I remember right, they represented somewhere between 30 and 40% of global GDP. And that's when Queen Victoria sent the ambassadors and the Chinese said, go home, there's nothing you have that we need. I'm not saying that's Xi's world right now, but I'm saying they are a very proud people and they have a long history of understanding what happens to them when they lose central control of their territories or the approaches to China, or they begin to splinter. And I believe they see themselves as a growing power in the Western Pacific, not just a regional power, but I think they're looking at themselves as a hegemonic entity in the Western Pacific and East Asia, and looking at the return to them as a global power. And I think that's their motivation. I think if you think of the emotionalism of Tibet and the Dalai Lama, that's not about religion. That's not about a mountainous area in China. That's about a province and splintering off. And that takes you to Hong Kong. It takes you to Taiwan. That's why I believe they're so vocal about Tibet and Hong Kong and potentially Taiwan, because they know if the provinces begin to splinter off, that takes them to a place they've seen before over the millennia. And remember, not all of them even speak the same language. It's a monster big country. And so I think what the Chinese are looking to do is to continue to produce economic power, continue to look for influence across the world. Their economic activities and their aid activities, their New Silk Road and their activities as far as foreign investment in minerals. They're very, very present in Africa, very present when it comes to strategic materials, rare earth. I think they have an idea of where they want to be, but equally they have an idea where they never want to go back to. And so I think the Chinese are looking to be, in their view, what they want China to be. And they want China to be a global power. And remember, the classic world order, the classic entities within the world that we live in now, with Bretton Woods, with the World Trade Organization, with all that, but none of those were signed on to by Communist China. Those were all signed on early on with nationalist China. So the current world order, the Chinese, I believe, see that as an opportunity for a world order defined by Beijing. And I don't think that's necessarily militarily. I think that could be across those commons. It could be sea lanes, it could be space, it could be cyber, it could be economic, it could be diplomatic, it could be trade. I think they're very aggressive in marking out where they want China to be over the next few decades and out. And so, you know, they're playing a pattern of return to the Middle Kingdom. You know, that's probably not the most accurate historic way to say that, but I think they see themselves as a global power, and that's where they want to be.
Is the Belt and Road Initiative working for them or not?
Well, I think it is, but you know, part of the critique you get from some people when you visit people in Africa and you talk to them, they say, "Yeah, we welcome the Chinese investment. We welcome the building the rail lines, building highways, building schools and clinics. But then when they build them, they issue us a big debt, and they never leave. The workers never leave. So that can't be an accident. That can't be a coincidence. I think that's part of the Chinese notion of engaging the world from the top down and the bottom up, and investing in putting Chinese resources and Chinese money. But also, look, there's a lot of fragility here too. I think the number, you're a Navy guy, so you know better than I will, but I think the numbers between 80 and 85% of their strategic petroleum comes through the Straits of Malacca across the South China Sea. So a country that big that is building coal-fired plants as fast as they can to provide energy is still very, very dependent on fossil fuels and hydrocarbons coming out of the Middle East. So is it a surprise they'd look to build a base in southern Pakistan? Is it a surprise they'd look to build a base in Djibouti? Is it a surprise they're looking to get out into the Indian Ocean in the western side? Because if 80 to 85% of your energy, your fossil fuel supplies have to cross either through the Straits of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, and across the Straits of Malacca, that's interdictable. So I think what I see of China is a slow, steady, focused effort on returning to where they see their rightful place in their view is. And make no mistake, they're living in space with us and the Russians. They're living in the cyber domain. They're at sea with us. They're operating in the air. They had the first woman spacewalk in orbit. So I think this is another opportunity to engage on these same issues with strategic arms limitation, with discussions on hypersonics, with discussions on space and cyber. I mean, Bill, you know, we spent years in the East-West Institute trying to get our arms around cybersecurity for these very reasons, to put effectively rules of the road in some kind of established international norm about cyber. I think there's ways to engage the Chinese. But your question, I kind of went off track there, but your question about Taiwan, I think Taiwan will be a tough nut to crack. You've got well over 100 miles plus to get across the Straits of Taiwan, and you've got to get across with a lot of people and a lot of material in a very short time. And that's not easy. From a military perspective, just the planning and the logistics of that, the staging of that, you're not going to be able to do that in the middle of the night with a lightning strike that no one sees coming. You're going to have to move brigades and divisions, and you're going to have to move large numbers of surface craft, and you're going to have a lot of command and control activity. You're going to have a lot of signals intelligence. You're going to have a lot of things going on. So it won't be just a bolt out of the blue. It's going to be something that the world will see coming. Well, like 175,000 Russians parked adjacent to the Ukraine.
Right. And China, unlike Russia, and certainly unlike the United States, hasn't exactly been a combat military force for the last 30 or 40 years. They haven't been fighting. And so this is starting from scratch.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bill. I think 1978, 1979 was the last
Right.
dust up they had, and that was with the Vietnamese, and I don't think that went well. Now, they spent a lot of time thinking about this, and they built some amazingly capable equipment, and they do a lot of training. But there's it's like Rick Atkinson's book, An Army at Dawn. You learn to fight by fighting. Whether I don't care who you are. If it's the Americans in 1941, 1942, or it doesn't matter. You learn to fight by fighting, from the 4-star theater commanders all the way down to the youngest kid aboard a ship or on a flight deck or in a foxhole, and they haven't fought.
Absolutely, yeah. Things changed a little bit from a training scenario to reality when rounds start coming back at you.
Yeah, it kind of focuses your attention a little bit.
It does.
But here's a thought for you. I have always found it curious when we used to go with the East-West Institute, when we would spend time with these guys, I would always ask them, the senior military and the senior diplomatic guys, do you really believe that the people of Taiwan who elect their leadership and have an unbelievably robust economy, do you really believe that they will willingly come home to mainland China? And they would always hesitate. There's always that moment where you don't, you're going to get the party line, but you're not going to get a really honest answer. And I used to ask them, if you really want Taiwan to come home, how are you going to treat Hong Kong as a model? And if you treat Hong Kong as a model to incentivize Taiwan to come home, it's a different path than you guys are taking right now with Hong Kong. I left Tibet out because that gets emotional about it. But Hong Kong is, I think, a good example. If you want to incentivize the people, the voters of Taiwan to come home, then perhaps you haven't done it right with Hong Kong. So I think Taiwan's going to be a tough nut to crack for those guys. And I think that's why you've seen over time, they really, their leadership really doesn't make very bold and aggressive, threatening statements about Taiwan, because I think they know in their hearts this is going to be a tough nut to crack. Taiwan may fight back.
Right.
And Japan and the United States may fight back. And Singapore and the Philippines and Indonesia may offer assistance. And then you get around to Vietnam and you get around to India, all the way around. And so pretty soon, who are your friends? And what happens in the international community if you take a shot at this and miss?
And who are your trading partners?
Yeah. And what if you take a shot and win it? Now what do you do? So there's a strategic discussion that must be going on continually inside Beijing between the civilian leadership and the military guys about, this won't be easy.
Or even if we think we can win it from the Beijing perspective, is winning it going to give us the result we want strategically, economically, diplomatically?
Exactly. What's the day after look like? Because if 80 to 85% of your petroleum has to go through the Straits of Malacca, it doesn't take the U.S. Navy to block the Straits of Malacca. Right. Or the Bab el-Mandeb or the Straits of Hormuz. So, I mean, if you take that back from importing ports, POL terminals on the Chinese coast or Hainan Island, and take that line of communication all the way back up into the Middle East or up into the Arabian Gulf, how many opportunities are there for those tankers not to make it to China? And the Chinese Navy is getting bigger, but it's not that big that it provides escort to every tanker.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between numbers and capability too.
Yeah,
absolutely. So you said earlier, General, you were talking about strategic minerals. What is the thought process on strategic minerals and China in Afghanistan? Or is there another reason they would be in Afghanistan and perhaps risk increased people, money, threats in Afghanistan? Because when you look at it historically, Alexander the Great didn't have a good time in Afghanistan. The Brits didn't have a good time in Afghanistan 3 times. The Russians didn't have a good time in Afghanistan. The Americans didn't have a good time in Afghanistan. So are the Chinese now going to roll into Afghanistan somewhere to go after mineral deposits and think that they're going to have a different result?
Well, it's a great question, Bill. I think most people I think most people may not realize that there's a shared border between Afghanistan and China. They're neighbors.
Yep.
The border area is not that big. It's not like Texas or from San Diego to Brownsville, but there is a shared border, and they have dealt with each other. I think the other reason Afghanistan is important to the Chinese is it offers a counter to India. And so you have a Pakistan piece of this, and the Chinese and the Pakis have become close over time, and they do a lot of work together. And the Pakistan and the eastern provinces of Afghanistan have been present for years and years and years, decades, centuries. So I think China and Afghanistan is a piece of a strategic puzzle that includes India, that includes raw materials, strategic minerals, rare earth. It's also a border of Pakistan, which is a trading partner, and they share a border. And I think the Chinese look at Afghanistan perhaps as an economic investment, like they've been doing in their Belt and Road Initiative. But I think, going back to your comments about people having issues in Afghanistan, I think a lot of folks don't realize that Afghanistan is a very tribal place. It's not a single entity. The tribes that live out in the west around Herat are totally different than the tribes that live in the east or the north. And so the Harazis or the Tajikis or the Pashtun, those are different tribal entities, and they are run in different ways, almost like families. And so when you conduct military operations there, you're always having to balance who the people are you're dealing with and what are their alliances and what are their motivations and what is their strategic vision. That border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, nobody recognizes that border. I mean, it's hard to do business up there because it's argumentative about where that line is. And so, and the narcotics business in the southern and southwest part of that country is billions and billions of dollars. And to go do business, I was the first senior guy after 9/11 to go into Afghanistan to command activities there. And before I left Washington, I asked the staff to get me some maps because as an aviator, I kind of like to have a map so I can see kind of spatial relationships of where things are. And they came back from the map room in the Pentagon and said, "Boss, we don't have any maps of Afghanistan." And I said, "What? We don't have maps of Afghanistan?" And they went, "No." So I said, "Go over to the National, GRF guys and see if they got maps." They came back and said, "We can't find any maps of Afghanistan." Well, Bill, I asked the aide, "Okay, go downtown to the National Geographic store and buy me a map of Afghanistan." So I fought the first 2+ years in Afghanistan with a National Geographic map because that's the only map I could get. And it's a long way away. It's 600 miles from the North Arabian Sea. If you're on a ship and you're launching targets inside Afghanistan, it's 600 miles. And if you're at Diego Garcia, the distance from Diego to targets in Afghanistan, it's the same from Tampa to Juneau, Alaska. And so whether you're Russian or English or whoever, it's a long way across the Hindu Kush Mountains into a very tribal place. It's a complicated place to do business. So I think the Chinese, because they're neighbors, see an opportunity. Because the Americans are out, the Europeans are out, the tribal entities are trying to coalesce themselves now around a Taliban and perhaps a return of ISIS or Al Qaeda. The social upheaval, we're seeing all these reports about lack of food and lack of medicines and things, and we're seeing a variety of activities. I think the Chinese may perhaps see an opportunity there for increased influence.
So interesting. When you look at when we first went into Afghanistan and the starvation rate was around 50%. In the time we were there, it dropped down into the 20s. It's now back up to almost 50% again. You have 23 million people starving right now. I have my thoughts about this, which are one, I think it's a national security issue, and two, I think it's just a plain straight up moral issue that we should be doing everything we can as a country and as a coalition to make sure that these people don't starve. And oh, by the way, I think that everything that gets dropped in there, the former chief of staff of the Air Force, I'm talking about dropping stuff in, so I'll defer to you on this, obviously, General. But everything that goes in there should have an American flag on it, so people understand that this is coming from the taxpayers of the United States, and there can be no confusion of where this bag of rice or whatever else it is that gets parachuted in is coming from. Your thoughts on that? Am I off base? Should we not be wasting money on this, or should we be doing everything we can to feed these people, understanding that some of that will probably be stolen and resold on the black market, and some of that will probably never get to the right people. But you got a lot of people starving over there right now. Your thoughts, sir?
Bill, I agree. I think we're looking at a mix of a humanitarian challenge as well as a geostrategic challenge. And I think there's an opportunity here for this place not to become a hotbed of hostile, disenfranchised people that have given up on their previous life, and they look for violence, or they look for opportunities to strike out or to lash out in frustration. I think there's ways to approach this. If you remember early in the Afghan campaign, we did conduct, in fact, the largest humanitarian series of drops in the history of combat aviation. We used multiple C-17s to drop tons and tons of food products. We figured out early on that the meals ready to eat were very useful, and they were very compact, and they were very welcomed. The ham steaks, not so much because of the culture of the country, but once we figured that out, I think there is a way to work this. And I think it's unfortunate the way the Americans left Afghanistan, that we could have done that much better. But I believe we have a humanitarian challenge, a global humanitarian challenge right now as we lead up into the winter months, because the weather in Afghanistan this time of year through March or April is very rough. And when you have 50% of the population perhaps nutritionally challenged, not to mention potable water and medicines, then you've got a big problem. And that could be a festering place for potential terrorism or potential acts of terrorism out of that. So I'm not, but I haven't been, but if I were asked, I would say it might be useful to have a discussion about a humanitarian effort that would either be United States if no one else wanted to. But I think that would be the right thing to do. We've done that in Bangladesh. We've done that in Indonesia. We've done that in a variety of places just because we think it's right. And I think this is one of those places.
General, you hear an awful lot of the pundits, et cetera, on television, on radio, et cetera. They'll say China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, almost as if it's one country now. They throw those four out there, and for some obvious reasons that you put those four together. Can you touch just a little bit on North Korea and Iran, since we still have a little bit of time?
Yeah, North Korea. In a previous life, I had a chance to spend 2 years as the senior DoD negotiator with the full-party talks with the North Koreans. And I think the bottom line for me is that the North Korean regimes over time have been focused on one thing primarily, and that is regime survival. And I think if you get your arms around that, then you understand why they do the things that they do. they also understand very clearly that if they cross a certain set of thresholds, that the regime will not only go away, but the entire leadership of that country will be wrapped up. And if you think what happened in Romania with Ceausescu and all of that very savage reaction to the collapse of the central government, the North Koreans are very, very focused on regime survival and on what manifests that. So we see the nukes, we see every once in a while we see activities with rockets and with missiles. We fired things into space. They haven't been that successful, but they do have a fairly large army, and they do have a fairly highly trained army, and they have a fairly, you want to say disciplined, but they haven't been fighting the South Koreans or anybody for a while either. But it's a regime focused on keeping itself alive, and I think over time, presidents of the United States understand that. I think there's ways to deal with them also, because remember, during the Clinton administration, we were shipping a large amounts of food and energy, petroleum products to those guys, just because of the famine and because of the health issues and et cetera. So I think there's a way to deal with the North Koreans. And also the North Koreans have been very desperate over time. That's probably too strong a word. They've been very desirous over time of peace accords that ceases the Korean War. The North Koreans, the Americans, and I think the Chinese signed those peace accords. The South Koreans didn't, because Syngman Rhee wouldn't do it. And so they want some kind of peace accord that would then open the country up to trade. And the United States in the four-party and then in the six-party talks have always been reluctant, because you need South Korea's okay for that, plus the Chinese, plus everything else. And then the Japanese play a big role in this because of the investments across the Tsushima Straits with South Korea and Japan. So I think the North Koreans, I think there's a certain logic to the way the North Koreans do business. And I think the Americans, for the most part, the Americans understand that to keep them from being overly aggressive, there are certain red lines. And I think from President Clinton through President Bush, President Trump for sure, I think they figured out ways to deal with the North Koreans in kind of a balance of activities. I think bellicose screaming and waving arms and throwing rocks at each other probably doesn't do any good. And I think anybody that deals with the North Koreans know they do that a lot, and you just ignore it. So I think the North Koreans could be, they could cause a lot of problems with a lot of death and destruction in South Korea, because remember, Seoul is only about 30 miles from the DMZ. But I think they also realize if they cross that line, their regime goes away.
Do you see an opportunity in our lifetime, or a possibility maybe, of North and South Korea unifying again?
I do. I think it is to their mutual advantage for Seoul and Pyongyang because of the families. Because remember, prior to the Korean War, the industrial part of Korea was in the north. The agricultural part was in the south. I think there have been multiple opportunities to do that. I think the real sticking point is who is going to have the most influence over the peninsula. Is it going to be the folks out of Pyongyang, or is it going to be the democratic economic engine out of Seoul that does that? So I have always thought that it used to be a bureau. Now I think it's a department, or it's a ministry of unification. But I think there are ways to do that, because at the end of the day, the Koreans are, my experience is the Koreans are a very family-focused culture. They're very proud of being Koreans. They're very proud of their families. They're very proud of the history of Korea, just rightfully so. Ancient, very, very beautiful culture. And when you sit down with them and spend a lot of time with them, whether it's North or South Koreans, it always comes back to the families, and families that were separated in the early 1950s, and the desire for families to be reunified. And there's opportunities there, Bill. We just, we sometimes get caught up in their rhetoric, and we lose sight of the fact that it's their decisions to be made, especially out of Seoul and Pyongyang, about reunification.
So go ahead.
The challenge with that is you're going to have a unified Korea. It's a powerful economic engine with nukes, and so there's a whole day after and a secondary and tertiary effect after that. But I think all that's manageable, and that's really up to the Koreans.
Well, that was a question I was going to follow up with. Actually, was do you see a scenario where North and South Korea reunite as a democratic nation, as a democracy? China says, okay, if the nukes go away and the United States steps off of the peninsula. Do you see that scenario ever playing out?
Well, I think that would be Beijing's desire, for the United States to be off the peninsula or away from the Western Pacific. Mm-hmm. I don't know what would motivate the coming home and the reunification. It could be starvation. It could be loss of crops. It could be any number of things that would create an environment for the South and the North to begin to work closer together. The Chinese, I don't think they would welcome a quick reunification, especially with the United States forces still on the peninsula. And I'm not sure they would welcome a reunified peninsula with nukes, because North Korea has become kind of economically dependent and intertwined with Beijing. South, not so much. So would Beijing lose a client with a reunified peninsula, with the economic throwaway to South Korea? I don't think the Chinese would warmly embrace a quick unification. And their neighbors in Japan might have, there would be kind of a Northeast Asia reordering there of equities between Tokyo and whatever the capital. I suspect it would be Seoul in Beijing. It would be a different world with a reunified peninsula in Northeast Asia.
So you're well known as being one of the, I'll say one of the real experts in Korea. But beyond that, you're really, really well known for understanding Iran, JCPOA, Iran, where we're at with Iran today.
Well, if you noticed in the last couple of days, the Iranians are either have or they're preparing to try to launch satellites again up into orbit. You've seen they've continued to enrich. The folks in the International Atomic Energy inspectors are saying that they have enriched and that they're on the cusp of having the weapons grade uranium or plutonium ready to go. Bill, I think another look at this from 50,000 feet helps. The Iranians are mostly Shia. 85% or so of the Muslim faith, the Islamic faith, is Sunni. But the majority of the Shia live in Iran. And so there has always been, since the death of the Prophet and shortly after the death of the Prophet, there has always been kind of a competitive nature and not a lot of affection between Sunni and Shia. And so Iran represents the Shia power, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states around the Arabian Gulf represent the preponderance of Sunni Islam. And the Arabs are different than the Persians. So you have a Persian Shia state across the Arabian Gulf from a set of Arab Sunni states. So you can see right there are two issues of contention. I think the Iranians are looking to be a regional power with influence beyond the Gulf. I think they want free economic entry into a global market with their petroleum and with access to Western and Eastern technology. I think they want to take themselves into a different world. But the challenge they've got is their leadership is so fundamentally focused that it's hard for them to get out into that world. Plus, the rest of the world has put sanctions on them. They're still, I believe, they're still the leading entity in the pursuit of terrorism with Hezbollah and Hamas. I think their export of missile technology and what they've done relative to the Israelis. I think this is a dangerous place, and it has to be contained as much as we can, and we have to be very, very careful about their outreach through these terrorist organizations. Remember, they sent a team to try to kill an ambassador in Washington. And we can go back to Kobar Towers, we can go back to the Marine Barracks, we can go back to the French paratroopers, we can go back to the chief of station in Beirut, taken and tortured. I mean, this is a global concern, not just for the Israelis or the Sunni Arabs, but for us as well.
So, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, the JCPOA, I get it that the Obama administration wanted some kind of agreement or reconciliation or some kind of metering on the Iranians and their nuclear program. I wasn't asked, and I wasn't a member of the Joint Chiefs, so I wasn't involved in that, but I would have not been supportive of that JCPOA the way it was written, because it didn't address ballistic missile exports, it didn't address terrorism, it didn't address weapons transfers, it didn't address any of that, and it gave, in a sequential timeline, it gave the Iranians pretty much what the Iranians wanted. It just delayed the execution of it. So when President Trump killed it, I think he killed it because in his mind, he saw that it wasn't going to come to the result, the mission of the JCPOA. I think President Trump saw that it wasn't going to come to that. So I think this administration is trying to reinvigorate that to get a deal, but I think we have to be very careful about what that deal is. And what does that mean? And here's another kind of an esoteric question. We've heard multiple presidents say that the Iranians will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Okay, a lot of people have said that. What does that mean? Does that mean we're going to ask them, please don't build a weapon? Does that mean we're going to say, we'll buy it from you? Does that mean, what does that mean? Is that a path to a kinetic strike? Is that a path? What does that mean? So words have meanings. And so when a president says, under no circumstances will we allow the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. Okay, so talk me through how are we going to do that? I think that's not well understood. And I think there's enough ambiguity there because people that know the Americans know that what does that mean in the American political system when you've got COVID, when you've got inflation, when you've got crime, when you've got a lot of stuff going on? Are the American people focused on an Iranian deal? I don't think so right now.
So General, we look at Iraq for a second. Saddam Hussein, clearly a thug, clearly rolls into another country, a neighboring country, rapes and pillages. He needed to go away. However, when he went away and when we de-Baathified Iraq, did we also lose a local check on the Iranians at the same time?
Absolutely. I was a part of that, Bill. I mean, you and I both were a part of that. And my read on that in the meetings that I was in, the senior military guys, my vote was do not disband the Iraqi army. Do not disband the Ministry of Interior. Do not disband the Ba'athist Party. Vet these guys in every way we can and vet them to get rid of the bad actors. But the Ministry of Interior ran the utilities in the country, the power, the water. The Ba'athist Party were kind of the county government level up. The Iranian army, the regular army, were the only people that anybody trusted. Not the Republican Guard, not the Special Republican Guard, not the intel guys. And so when we decided to disband those three entities, we set the conditions right there for some terrible things that followed. Not to mention a strategic block on Iran. Because when we disbanded the Iraqi army, those guys all went home with their weapons. When we disbanded the Ministry of the Interior, the people that ran the water and the sewer and power distributions, when we sent them home, everything began to collapse. I mean, remember how Baghdad would go dark about every 3 or 4 days. And the Ba'athist Party, those were the city and county governments, effectively. I mean, they don't call them city and county, but I mean, those were the functioning governmental entities across the country. I think that was short-sighted, and the second and third order effect of that. I mean, we know what happened in the central part of Iraq and the western part of Iraq. We know what happened with ISIS, and we know that now there is not a block on Iran, which used to be what Iraq did, and the Turks aren't that block. And so, who is the deterrent entity on the Iranians? It's not the Afghans to the east, or the Iraqis to the west, or the Turks to the north. And so I think Iran is a challenge. I mean, if we were in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or Kuwait City or Muscat or Doha or Manama, we'd be looking at this and be very nervous about this.
So, General, we're coming up on an hour here, but you had mentioned earlier kind of closer to home, Venezuela, Cuba, some other issues here closer to home. Can you just touch on those for just a couple minutes?
Well, it was I think it was a day or 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, a great article on Venezuela and the Cuban influence in Venezuela. Venezuela was a country with large petroleum reserves, very, very wealthy country, very respected. And now look at it. I mean, the inflation rates are so high, the malnutrition is such, the people are in such dire straits, and the Cubans have become kind of a partner in all of this with Venezuela. And that just breaks your heart. I mean, a country that was so able to focus itself on its own future now is just barely hanging on in the Western Hemisphere. And you look at what might have been for Venezuela as far as petroleum, as far as minerals, as far as trade, as far as voting rights, because remember the United States transferred a lot of materials to the Venezuelan military because we were operating with them, training with them, steaming, flying with those guys, and now that just, to me, that was avoidable. And the Cubans, I think we've taken some missteps with them also. I think we should be very careful about opening the doors diplomatically to Cuba right now. I think we should be very focused on what we can do to support the Cuban people. I think we should be very focused on what we should do relative to continued sanctions, because those people are not living in a happy place down there right now. That's 90 miles from Key West. I mean, Cuba, I've not been there, but my experience reading about it, I've been to the Philippines a lot, and my experience is like the Philippines. You can plant almost anything and it will grow there. So the potential for agriculture and agricultural exports. Remember, prior to the revolution, the United States, mostly Europe, got most of its sugar out of Cuba. And so it just frustrates me that we politically can't figure out a way to get at this problem and free an entire country that's 90 miles from us, from this oppression that they lived in. And I think sending a lot of money down there goes straight into the Cuban military. It doesn't go to the people. I don't know that if you pin me down, I would have a specific operational objective answer to how to do that. But I think with some smart people, you could probably work your way through that. But Venezuela and Cuba, the people are living in a terrible place right now. And I'm not trying to sound Pollyanna. I'm just saying, as a hardcore military guy, sometimes the hardcore military is not the answer to this. but it's the backstop to this. The diplomatic and economic pieces of this need to be played. And I don't think we focused on Cuba and Venezuela the right way. I think we need to focus economically on what benefits the people there and what disenfranchises the criminal leadership in both of those countries. I don't know if that makes sense, Bill.
Makes complete sense. General, it's been an absolute pleasure. I can't believe we're already at an hour plus here. Been an absolute pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, we have General T. Michael Moseley, the 18th Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force with us today. General, thank you so very much for joining us.
Bill, thank you. Thank you for including me, and I wish all your listeners a wonderful holiday, a Merry Christmas.